Welcome to Slumbertainment. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let yourself relax. Tonight we explore the history of telecommunications. Please like and subscribe for more restful content. Now, let's begin. Long before humans developed written language, we faced a fundamental challenge that would shape the course of civilization: how to communicate across distance. The need to send warnings, coordinate hunts, announce victories, or simply maintain contact with distant communities drove our ancestors to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of projecting messages beyond the reach of the human voice. These early systems, ingenious in their simplicity, laid the conceptual groundwork for every telecommunications technology that would follow across the millennia. The earliest known system of distance communication emerged in the form of smoke signals, a technology independently developed by cultures across every inhabited continent. Indigenous peoples of North America refined this method to remarkable sophistication, using carefully controlled fires and damp materials to create columns of smoke that could be seen for dozens of miles across open terrain. By manipulating blankets or hides over the smoke source, they created distinct patterns, each carrying specific meanings understood within their communities. A series of puffs might signal the approach of strangers, while a steady column could indicate a successful hunt. The system's elegance lay in its binary simplicity, similar in principle to the ones and zeros that would eventually form the basis of digital communication thousands of years later. In ancient China, smoke signals evolved into an integral component of military communication along the Great Wall. Beacon towers, spaced at regular intervals across the wall's vast expanse, allowed messages to travel hundreds of miles in a matter of hours. During the Han Dynasty, around 2,000 years ago, military engineers developed a sophisticated coding system that combined smoke signals during daylight with fire beacons at night. The number of smoke columns or flames indicated specific types of threats, from the size of approaching forces to the direction of their advance. This network represented perhaps humanity's first true telecommunications infrastructure, a coordinated system of relay stations that functioned as an early warning network protecting an empire. The ancient Greeks developed their own visual communication system known as hydraulic telegraphy, attributed to the engineer Aeneas Tacticus in the 4th century before the Common Era. This ingenious device used identical water clocks at two distant locations. As water drained from a vessel at a predetermined rate, it lowered a float connected to a rod marked with various messages. When the sender lit a torch, the receiver would simultaneously start draining their own vessel. When the sender extinguished the torch, both parties would stop their clocks, and the message could be read based on which marking aligned with the water level. Though limited in vocabulary, this system demonstrated a crucial principle. Standardization between sender and receiver allowed for precise communication across distance. Fire beacons represented another widespread solution to distance communication, particularly suited to military and defensive purposes. The ancient Persians maintained an extensive beacon system throughout their empire, allowing messages to travel from the Aegean Sea to the Persian heartland in a single day, a journey that would take a mounted courier several weeks. These beacons typically consisted of elevated platforms where watchmen maintained constant vigilance, ready to ignite prepared pyres upon receiving a signal from the previous station. The system's speed was extraordinary for its time, but it shared a significant limitation with all visual communication methods. It could convey only predetermined messages, lacking the flexibility to transmit complex or unexpected information. The Romans further refined beacon technology, establishing chains of signal stations throughout their empire. Along Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, built during the 2nd century of the Common Era, archaeological evidence reveals a sophisticated network of mile castles and turrets, each within visual range of its neighbours. Soldiers stationed at these posts used smoke during the day and fire at night to relay warnings of raids or coordinate military responses. The Roman military writer Vegetius described in his treatises how different signal patterns could convey various tactical situations, demonstrating that even within the constraints of visual signalling, ancient engineers sought to maximize information density. In coastal regions and islands, maritime communities developed their own visual communication systems adapted to their unique environmental challenges. Greek and Phoenician sailors used fire signals from headlands and islands to guide ships and warn of dangers. The lighthouse at Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, completed around 280 before the Common Era, served not only as a navigational aid, but also as a massive signal station. Its beacon, visible for many miles across the Mediterranean, could be modulated to send messages between the city and distant points along the coast, linking the commercial empire through light. Aboriginal Australians employed smoke signals as part of a broader communication system that included message sticks and song lines. Their smoke signalling techniques, refined over tens of thousands of years, represented the oldest continuous telecommunication tradition on Earth. Different tribes developed region-specific codes, and the skills required to generate clear, readable signals in varying wind conditions and terrain required extensive training. Young people learned not only how to create effective smoke columns, but also how to position themselves to maximize visibility while remaining concealed from potential enemies, demonstrating that telecommunications has always involved considerations of security and strategic advantage. The limitations of these early visual systems became apparent in adverse weather conditions, at night or across terrain, lacking clear lines of sight. Yet these constraints drove innovation. Polynesian navigators, unable to rely on visual signals across vast ocean distances, developed an alternative system based on physical tokens. They created intricate stick charts that encoded information about wave patterns, currents, and island locations, essentially creating a stored communication medium that could be carried across distances and interpreted by those trained in their reading. This represented a different approach to the telecommunication challenge. Rather than transmitting information in real time, they developed standardized methods for encoding and transporting information. As human societies grew more complex and interconnected, the need for more sophisticated communication systems became increasingly urgent. These early visual methods, for all their ingenuity, could transmit only limited, predetermined information. The next leap forward would require harnessing new principles, moving beyond fire and smoke to systems that could encode the full complexity of human language and thought across distance. The limitations of smoke and fire as communication media became increasingly apparent as European nations expanded their territories and commercial interests during the 18th century. Military commanders needed to send detailed orders. Merchants required precise information about cargo and prices, and governments sought rapid intelligence about distant events. The solution emerged not through a revolutionary new technology, but through the systematic refinement of visual signalling using a principle that had existed since ancient times, the semaphore. The modern semaphore system originated in France during a period of extraordinary turmoil and innovation. In 1792, as revolutionary France found itself at war with much of Europe, a young engineer named Claude Chappe proposed an ambitious solution to the government's communication crisis. Chappe had been experimenting with various signalling methods, including synchronized clocks similar to those used by the ancient Greeks, but he recognized that what France needed was a system capable of transmitting complex messages rapidly across the nation. His invention, which he called the tachygraphy, meaning fast writer, would soon be renamed the telegraph, from the Greek words meaning distant writing. Chap's system consisted of a network of towers, each topped with a mobile apparatus comprising a horizontal beam with two smaller movable arms at each end. Operators inside the tower used ropes and pulleys to position these arms into various configurations, each representing a different symbol or letter. By using telescopes, operators at the next tower in the chain could observe these positions and reproduce them on their own apparatus, creating a relay system that could transmit messages across France at previously unimaginable speeds. The first line, connecting Paris to Lille, a distance of over 200 kilometers, became operational in 1794. The speed of the Chap telegraph astonished contemporary observers. A message could travel from Paris to Lille in approximately 9 minutes, compared to the several hours required by the fastest horse courier. This dramatic compression of time and space had immediate military applications. During the wars of the French Revolution, commanders in Paris could coordinate operations with generals at the front with unprecedented efficiency. News of the recapture of the city of Condé-sur-Lescaut reached Paris within an hour of the event, allowing the government to make strategic decisions while battles were still unfolding rather than days or weeks afterward. The system's success led to rapid expansion. By 1846, France possessed over 5,000 kilometers of semaphore telegraph lines connecting major cities across the nation. The network employed thousands of operators who worked in shifts to maintain 24-hour service on crucial routes. These operators developed remarkable skill in reading distant signals through telescopes, even in marginal weather conditions. The profession required excellent eyesight, physical stamina to operate the heavy mechanical arms, and the ability to memorize extensive code books that translated between the mechanical positions and actual messages. Other European nations quickly recognized the strategic value of optical telegraphy. Sweden developed an extensive network connecting Stockholm with coastal fortresses and naval bases, essential for a nation whose geography featured thousands of islands and immense distances. The Swedish system, designed by Abraham Niklas Edelkrantz, used shutters that could be opened or closed to create different patterns visible through telescopes. This design proved more reliable than articulated arms in harsh Nordic weather conditions, where ice and strong winds could damage more delicate mechanisms. Britain established a semaphore line between London and the naval base at Portsmouth, allowing the Admiralty to communicate with the fleet and receive intelligence from ships arriving in port. The operational requirements of these networks created some of the first telecommunications infrastructure industries. Tower construction required precise engineering to ensure that each station remained visible from its neighbours while providing protection for operators and equipment. The towers themselves became landmarks, often built on hilltops or elevated artificial platforms to maximise line of sight. Maintenance crews travelled the routes regularly, repairing equipment and clearing vegetation that might obstruct views between stations. The networks operated according to strict protocols, with message priority systems that ensured military and government communications took precedence over commercial traffic. Claude Chap himself remained involved with the system's development until his death in 1805. Suffering from illness and reportedly distressed by disputes over credit for the invention, he took his own life. His brothers, who had collaborated on the system's development, continued to oversee its expansion and refinement. The Chap telegraph represented their collective achievement, a system that demonstrated how standardized protocols and coordinated infrastructure could overcome the limitations of individual human communication. Commercial interests soon recognized the telegraph's potential beyond military applications. Financial markets, in particular, benefited enormously from rapid price information. Merchants in Paris could learn of goods arriving in Bordeaux or Marseille within minutes rather than days, allowing them to make trading decisions with current information. This compression of commercial time fundamentally altered market dynamics, creating advantages for those with access to the telegraph network and disadvantages for those without. The economic value of information speed became apparent, a pattern that would repeat with every subsequent telecommunications advance. Despite its sophistication and widespread adoption, the optical telegraph system suffered from inherent limitations that would ultimately prove insurmountable. Weather conditions frequently disrupted service, with fog, heavy rain, or snow making visual observation impossible. The system could not operate at night without expensive and less effective lamp-based modifications. Each message required manual intervention at every relay station, introducing opportunities for error and limiting overall speed. Most critically, the system's capacity remained fixed by the physical limitations of human operators working mechanical equipment. The optical telegraph networks reached their peak extent in the mid-19th century, by which time several thousand kilometers of lines crisscrossed Europe. Yet even as nations invested in expanding these networks, a new technology was emerging that would render them obsolete within a generation. The principle of using electricity to transmit information had been discussed theoretically for decades, but practical implementation required advances in understanding electromagnetic phenomena and the development of reliable electrical apparatus. Those advances were about to transform telecommunications more profoundly than anything achieved in the previous 10,000 years of human communication. The discovery that electricity could transmit information emerged gradually from decades of scientific investigation into electromagnetic phenomena. In the early decades of the 19th century, researchers across Europe and America conducted experiments that revealed fundamental relationships between electricity and magnetism. The Danish physicist Hans Christian Ørsted demonstrated in 1820 that electric current flowing through a wire could deflect a magnetic compass needle. This seemingly simple observation opened a new realm of possibility, suggesting that electrical signals might be transmitted along wires and detected at distant points through their magnetic effects. Building on these theoretical foundations, various inventors began developing practical telegraphic apparatus. In England, Charles Wheatstone and William Fothergill Cooke created a system that used multiple wires and needles that pointed to letters on a diamond-shaped board. Their telegraph entered commercial service in 1839 along the Great Western Railway, demonstrating for the first time that electrical communication could operate reliably over significant distances. Railway companies quickly recognized the telegraph's value for coordinating train movements and preventing collisions, establishing a symbiotic relationship between rail and telegraph that would shape both industries for generations. Across the Atlantic, an artist named Samuel Morse developed what would become the dominant telegraphic system worldwide. Morse had no formal training in electrical science, but possessed an inventor's determination and, crucially, secured the collaboration of skilled technicians who could realize his concepts. His key innovation lay not in the electrical apparatus itself, which resembled other contemporary designs, but in the coding system he devised for representing letters and numbers. Morse code used combinations of short and long electrical pulses, dots and dashes, to represent each character of the alphabet. This elegant solution maximized information transmission while minimizing the complexity of the sending and receiving equipment. Morse's system made its public debut in 1844 with a dramatic demonstration between Washington and Baltimore. The first message transmitted, "What hath God wrought?" was received clearly 40 miles away, proving that electrical telegraphy could function reliably over practical distances. The phrase, selected from the biblical Book of Numbers, reflected the era's sense that something momentous had occurred. Within a decade, thousands of miles of telegraph wire stretched across the United States, connecting cities and towns in a network that operated at the speed of electricity itself. The construction of telegraph networks required solving numerous technical and logistical challenges. Early telegraph lines followed railway routes, taking advantage of existing rights of way and the railway's need for communication infrastructure. Telegraph poles became a ubiquitous feature of the landscape, marching across fields and through forests in geometric progression. The wire itself demanded careful specification, requiring sufficient conductivity to carry signals over long distances while remaining affordable enough for extensive deployment. Copper emerged as the preferred material, offering an optimal balance of electrical and economic properties. Operating a telegraph station required specialized skills that created a new profession: the telegraph operator. These individuals learned to send and receive Morse code at high speeds, their fingers dancing across telegraph keys in rhythmic patterns that spelled out messages. Skilled operators could identify colleagues by their distinctive sending styles, recognizing individual fists, just as one might recognize a person's handwriting. The profession attracted both men and women at a time when few technical careers welcomed female participation. Telegraph operators formed a distinctive occupational culture, developing their own slang and taking pride in their ability to handle high-speed communication under pressure. The telegraph's impact on business and journalism proved transformative. Financial markets gained access to price information from distant exchanges within minutes, fundamentally altering trading patterns and market integration. Newspapers established telegraph networks to gather news from correspondents across wide regions, creating the modern concept of timely news reporting. The Associated Press, founded in 1846, pioneered the use of telegraph technology to distribute news stories to multiple subscribing newspapers simultaneously, establishing the wire service model that would dominate news distribution for over a century. Military applications of the telegraph emerged quickly and dramatically during the American Civil War. Both Union and Confederate forces deployed thousands of miles of field telegraph lines, allowing commanders to coordinate operations across vast theaters. President Abraham Lincoln spent many hours in the War Department's telegraph office, reading dispatches from battlefields and sending orders that could reach generals within minutes. This represented warfare at a new tempo, where strategic decisions could be made and implemented far more rapidly than in any previous conflict. The telegraph operator became as essential to military operations as cavalry scouts had been in earlier eras. The most ambitious telegraph project of the 19th century sought to bridge the Atlantic Ocean itself. Laying a cable across 3,000 miles of deep ocean presented extraordinary technical challenges. The cable needed sufficient strength to withstand deployment at great depths, while maintaining electrical conductivity over unprecedented distances. Early attempts in the 1850s failed due to cable breaks and electrical problems. The successful completion of the transatlantic cable in 1866, after years of setbacks and enormous financial investment, marked a watershed moment in human connectivity. For the first time, messages could travel between Europe and North America in minutes, rather than the weeks required for ships to cross the ocean. The engineer primarily responsible for this achievement, William Thomson, later known as Lord Kelvin, made crucial innovations in signal detection and electrical theory that enabled long-distance submarine telegraphy. His mirror galvanometer could detect the extremely weak signals that arrived after travelling through thousands of miles of cable, where electrical resistance degraded the current to barely measurable levels. Thomson's work demonstrated how theoretical physics and practical engineering combined to solve problems at the frontier of technological possibility. By the late 19th century, Telegraph cables connected continents and crossed oceans, creating the first truly global communication network. British-controlled cables formed the backbone of this system, linking London to India, Australia, and eventually circumnavigating the globe. These cables carried not only commercial and personal messages, but also the administrative communications of empire, allowing colonial governors to receive instructions from distant capitals with unprecedented speed. The telegraph compressed global space and time, making the world functionally smaller and binding distant regions into integrated economic and political systems. Yet even as the telegraph reached its maximum extent and sophistication, inventors and scientists were exploring a new frontier in telecommunications. If electrical signals could travel through wires, could they perhaps travel through space itself, without any physical connection between sender and receiver? This question would drive the next revolution in distance communication, one that would make even the global telegraph network seem limited by comparison. The theoretical foundations for wireless communication emerged from one of the most elegant intellectual achievements in physics: James Clerk Maxwell's equations describing electromagnetic radiation. Working in the 1860s, Maxwell demonstrated mathematically that electricity and magnetism represented different aspects of a unified phenomenon, and that electromagnetic waves should propagate through space at the speed of light. His equations predicted that these waves existed across a broad spectrum of frequencies, most of which remained undetected by existing instruments. Maxwell died in 1879, never witnessing the experimental confirmation of his theories or their technological applications. That confirmation came from the German physicist Heinrich Hertz, who in 1887 successfully generated and detected electromagnetic waves in his laboratory. Hertz's apparatus consisted of a spark gap transmitter that created electromagnetic disturbances and a simple loop antenna with another spark gap that responded to these disturbances across his laboratory. The sparks that jumped the gap in his receiver proved that invisible electromagnetic waves travelled through space, vindicating Maxwell's theoretical predictions. Hertz himself doubted that his experiments had practical applications, reportedly stating that the waves were of no use whatsoever. History would prove this assessment spectacularly incorrect. Multiple inventors recognized the potential for wireless telegraphy almost immediately. In Russia, Alexander Popov demonstrated a lightning detector that could sense electromagnetic disturbances from storms, then modified it to receive intentional signals. In Britain, Oliver Lodge conducted public demonstrations of wireless signalling, but the inventor who would dominate the early development of wireless communication was a young Italian named Guglielmo Marconi, whose genius lay not primarily in scientific innovation, but in engineering refinement and commercial vision. Marconi began experimenting with wireless apparatus in 1894 at his family's estate near Bologna. He systematically improved the range of his equipment, raising antennas higher and increasing transmitter power. When the Italian government showed little interest in his work, he travelled to Britain, where his mother's connections helped him secure support and patents. By 1897, Marconi had demonstrated wireless communication across the Bristol Channel, a distance of 9 miles. The commercial potential became apparent, particularly for ship-to-shore communication, where laying cables was impractical. The extension of wireless telegraphy from land stations to ships at sea created the first mobile communication network. Vessels equipped with Marconi apparatus could send and receive messages while underway, a capability that enhanced both safety and operational efficiency. Shipping companies could redirect vessels to different ports based on cargo demands, and ships in distress could summon help from vessels beyond visual range. The value of this technology became tragically apparent in 1912, when the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg. The ship's wireless operators transmitted distress signals that brought rescue ships to save over 700 survivors who would otherwise have perished in the North Atlantic. Marconi's most famous achievement came in 1901 when he successfully transmitted wireless signals across the Atlantic Ocean. Many scientists believed that radio waves, like light, would travel in straight lines and thus could not bridge the curved surface of the Earth over such distances. Marconi's transmitter in Cornwall, England, sent the letter S in Morse code, 3 dots, repeatedly. At a receiving station in Newfoundland, using a wire antenna suspended from a kite to gain altitude, Marconi detected the faint signals. The transmission proved that radio waves could somehow follow the Earth's curvature, a phenomenon later explained by the discovery of the ionosphere, an electrically charged layer of the upper atmosphere that reflects radio waves back toward Earth. The early years of radio communications suffered from significant technical limitations. All stations operated on similar frequencies, meaning that anyone with a receiver could hear all transmissions within range. Privacy was impossible, and interference between stations created constant problems. Radio operators developed informal protocols to minimize conflicts, but the medium's openness led to chaos during emergencies when multiple stations attempted to transmit simultaneously. Governments began imposing regulations requiring licenses and assigning specific frequencies to different users, creating the first frameworks for managing the electromagnetic spectrum as a limited resource. The development of voice transmission represented the next major advance in wireless technology. Early radio systems transmitted only Morse code, requiring trained operators at both ends. Reginald Fessenden, a Canadian inventor working in the United States, developed amplitude modulation techniques that allowed radio waves to carry voice and music. On Christmas Eve 1906, he broadcast what is generally considered the first radio program, including speech and phonograph music, to surprised wireless operators on ships in the Atlantic. This demonstration proved that radio could transmit the human voice across distances, opening possibilities far beyond telegraphy. The invention of the vacuum tube triode by Lee de Forest in 1906 provided the crucial component for practical voice radio. The triode could amplify weak signals and generate continuous radio waves at stable frequencies, solving two major technical problems that had limited earlier systems. De Forest called his device the audiome and recognized its potential to transform radio from a point-to-point communication medium into a broadcast medium, capable of reaching many receivers simultaneously. He conducted early broadcasts of music and speech, envisioning a future where radio would bring entertainment and information into homes. World War I accelerated radio technology development enormously. Military forces required reliable wireless communication for coordinating naval vessels, aircraft, and ground forces. Governments imposed strict controls on radio equipment and operations, forbidding civilian radio activity in many countries to prevent interference with military communications and intelligence gathering. Engineers developed more sophisticated equipment capable of operating on different frequencies and with improved range and reliability. By the war's end in 1918, radio technology had advanced further than it might have in decades of peacetime development. The post-war period saw an explosion of interest in radio broadcasting. Stations began regular transmissions of news, music, and entertainment, creating the first electronic mass medium. In the United States, station KDKA in Pittsburgh launched scheduled broadcasts in 1920, beginning with returns from the presidential election. Within a few years, hundreds of stations operated across North America and Europe, and millions of households owned radio receivers. The ability to hear voices and music from distant cities transformed domestic life and created shared cultural experiences on an unprecedented scale. Radio also revolutionized long-distance telecommunications. Shortwave radio, operating at higher frequencies than early systems, could reach around the world by bouncing off the ionosphere multiple times. International radio telephone service began in the 1920s, allowing voice conversations between continents, though initially at enormous cost and limited capacity. The technology remained imperfect, with static fading and interference creating challenging listening conditions, but it represented a quantum leap beyond the telegraph's click and pause rhythm. As radio matured, engineers and inventors turned their attention to an even more ambitious goal, transmitting not just sound, but moving images through space. This new frontier would require solving problems orders of magnitude more complex than those conquered by radio pioneers, but the potential rewards seemed limitless. The challenge of transmitting images electronically captivated inventors and scientists from the late 19th century onward. Unlike sound, which could be represented as varying electrical currents corresponding to pressure waves in air, images required capturing and transmitting information about light intensity at thousands of individual points nearly simultaneously. The human eye and brain process visual information with remarkable speed and sophistication, and any electronic television system would need to match that performance to create recognizable moving pictures. Early approaches to television relied on mechanical scanning systems. The German inventor Paul Nipkow patented a rotating disc design in 1884 that used a spiral pattern of holes to scan an image line by line. As the disc rotated, each hole swept across a different horizontal line of the image, and a light-sensitive cell behind the disc measured the brightness at each point. The resulting varying electrical current could be transmitted and used to control a light source behind an identical disc rotating in synchronization at the receiver, reconstructing the image. The Nipkow disc was brilliantly simple in concept, but suffered from severe practical limitations, producing dim, flickering images of very low resolution. John Logie Baird, a Scottish inventor working with limited resources in a makeshift laboratory, developed the first practical mechanical television system in the 1920s. His apparatus used Nipkow discs, along with various improvements including brighter light sources and more sensitive photoelectric cells. In 1926, Baird demonstrated his system to members of the Royal Institution in London, transmitting recognizable moving images of human faces. The demonstration generated enormous public interest, and Baird continued refining his system, achieving the first transatlantic television transmission in 1928 and the first television programming by the BBC beginning in 1929. Despite these achievements, mechanical television faced insurmountable limitations. The rotating discs could not spin fast enough to produce high-resolution images without creating dangerous mechanical stresses. Image brightness remained poor because the scanning holes allowed only a small fraction of the available light to reach the photoelectric cell. Most critically, the mechanical approach could not easily be scaled up to produce larger or clearer pictures without the apparatus becoming impractically large and complex. The future of television lay not in mechanical devices, but in electronic systems that had no moving parts. The electronic television system emerged from work by several inventors, but the key breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a teenage farm boy from Idaho named Philo Farnsworth. While still in high school in 1921, Farnsworth conceived of a system that would use electrons to scan images, eliminating mechanical components entirely. His inspiration reportedly came while ploughing his family's potato field in straight parallel rows, which gave him the insight that an electron beam could scan an image in similar horizontal lines. After years of struggle to secure funding and develop working apparatus, Farnsworth successfully demonstrated his image dissector camera tube and electronic receiver in 1927, transmitting the image of a simple line to a receiver in the same laboratory. Simultaneously, Vladimir Zorikin, a Russian-born engineer working for RCA in the United States, developed his own electronic television system. Zorikin's iconoscope camera tube and kinescope display tube used different technical approaches than Farnsworth's designs but achieved similar results. The two inventors became embroiled in bitter patent disputes that lasted years, though both men made essential contributions to practical television. Zorikin's corporate backing at RCA gave him resources far beyond what Farnsworth could muster independently, and RCA's version of electronic television ultimately dominated the market. Electronic television offered dramatic advantages over mechanical systems. The cathode ray tube display could produce much brighter images with higher resolution. The electronic camera could respond more quickly to changes in the scene, enabling smoother motion reproduction. Perhaps most importantly, electronic systems could be improved incrementally by refining the electron guns, phosphor coatings, and electronic circuits without fundamental redesign. By the mid-1930s, electronic television had clearly surpassed mechanical systems, and major corporations began investing heavily in development and commercialization. The first regular television broadcasting services launched in the late 1930s. The BBC inaugurated electronic television service from Alexandra Palace in London in 1936, transmitting a few hours of programming daily to the few hundred television sets in the London area. NBC began regular broadcasts in New York in 1939, coinciding with the World's Fair, where television sets were demonstrated to an amazed public. These early broadcasts reached tiny audiences, as television receivers remained expensive luxury items priced beyond most households' means. The technology clearly had potential, but its development was about to be interrupted by global conflict. World War II halted civilian television development as electronics manufacturers converted to military production. However, the war drove rapid advances in electronics, radar, and radio frequency technology that would benefit television when peace returned. Engineers gained experience with high-frequency circuits, improved cathode ray tubes for radar displays, and refined manufacturing techniques for complex electronic equipment. This wartime experience created a pool of technical expertise ready to apply their knowledge to peacetime products when hostilities ended. The post-war years witnessed explosive growth in television adoption. In the United States, the number of households with television sets grew from fewer than 10,000 in 1946 to more than 15 million by 1952. Manufacturers competed to produce sets at lower prices while improving picture quality and reliability. The television screen became the focal point of the family living room, fundamentally altering domestic architecture and social patterns. Evening schedules reorganized around broadcast programming, creating shared viewing experiences that defined popular culture. Television's impact on society proved as profound as radio's introduction a generation earlier, perhaps more so. The medium combined radio's ability to reach mass audiences instantly with the emotional impact of moving images. News broadcasts brought distant events into living rooms with unprecedented immediacy. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953 drew an estimated 20 million viewers in Britain alone, many watching in neighbours' homes if they lacked their own sets. In the United States, televised coverage of Senate hearings and presidential debates gave citizens direct visual access to political processes previously experienced only through print or radio. The technology continued evolving rapidly through the 1950s and 60s. Colour television, demonstrated experimentally since the 1920s, became commercially practical with the adoption of compatible colour broadcast standards that allowed both colour and black and white receivers to display the same transmissions. The American NTSC color system, introduced in 1953, and later the European PAL and CCAM systems, added color information to the television signal through ingenious encoding schemes that multiplied the technical complexity but enriched the viewing experience enormously. Television also became a tool for education and cultural exchange. Networks broadcast symphony concerts, theatrical productions, and educational programming alongside entertainment and news. International broadcasting allowed people to see how others lived in distant countries, fostering both understanding and aspiration. The technology that had seemed impossibly futuristic just decades earlier became so commonplace that its presence was taken for granted. Yet television remained fundamentally a broadcast medium, sending the same content simultaneously to all receivers. The next revolution in telecommunications would make communication more personal, more immediate, and more ubiquitous than even television's pioneers had imagined. While television captured public imagination in the mid-20th century, another telecommunications technology was quietly revolutionizing personal and business communication: the telephone. The story of the telephone begins with Alexander Graham Bell, a Scottish-born speech teacher working in Boston who became obsessed with the idea of transmitting voice electrically. Bell's interest stemmed partly from his family background, as both his grandfather and father worked as elocutionists, and his mother was deaf, which focused Bell's attention on the nature of sound and hearing. Bell was not alone in pursuing electrical voice transmission. Elisha Gray, working independently, developed remarkably similar apparatus and filed a patent caveat on the same day in 1876 that Bell filed his full patent application. The timing created one of the most famous priority disputes in technological history. Bell's patent, granted in March 1876, proved to be among the most valuable ever issued. 3 days after receiving the patent, Bell successfully transmitted the first intelligible sentence by telephone. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you," spoken to his assistant Thomas Watson in another room. The telephone worked by converting sound waves into varying electrical currents. Bell's design used a thin membrane attached to a wire suspended in a magnetic field. Sound waves cause the membrane to vibrate, moving the wire and inducing corresponding variations in electrical current flowing through the circuit. At the receiving end, a similar device operated in reverse, with electrical variations causing a membrane to vibrate and reproduce the original sound. The principle was elegantly simple, though achieving adequate volume and clarity required years of refinement. Early telephone service faced significant technical challenges. The electrical signals weakened rapidly over distance, limiting conversations to a few miles at most. Background noise and crosstalk, where conversations on one line could be faintly heard on another, plagued the system. The telephone itself required users to hold a single handset containing both transmitter and receiver, a design that evolved only gradually toward the familiar configuration. Despite these limitations, the telephone's ability to enable real-time conversation across distance made its advantages immediately apparent. The Bell Telephone Company, founded in 1877, faced the enormous task of building a telephone network from nothing. Unlike the telegraph, which could function with relatively sparse infrastructure connecting major cities, the telephone's value increased dramatically with the number of subscribers who could call each other. This network effect meant that telephone systems needed to reach critical mass in local areas before becoming truly useful. Bell's company focused initially on business customers in urban areas, where concentration of potential users made building networks economically viable. Telephone exchanges emerged as the crucial infrastructure linking subscribers. Early systems required callers to alert an operator, who would then manually connect the call by plugging wires into the appropriate jacks on a switchboard. These operators, initially boys but soon predominantly women, became essential workers in the telephone system. They memorized subscriber numbers, handled emergencies, and maintained the human face of what was becoming an increasingly essential utility. The switchboard operator represented one of the first significant employment opportunities for women into the technology sector. The expansion of telephone service across the United States required solving the technical problem of long-distance transmission. Michael Pupin, a Serbian immigrant physicist working at Columbia University, invented loading coils in 1899 that could be inserted at intervals along telephone lines to reduce signal degradation. His invention, along with improved cable designs and more sensitive receivers, extended practical telephone range from miles to hundreds of miles. By the early 20th century, transcontinental telephone service became technically feasible, though building the infrastructure required massive investment. The first transcontinental telephone call took place in 1915, connecting Alexander Graham Bell in New York with Thomas Watson in San Francisco. The call, staged as a publicity event, recreated Bell's famous first telephone message nearly 40 years earlier. The achievement demonstrated that telephone communication could span the continent, though long-distance calls remained expensive and relatively rare for decades. Most telephone use remained local, connecting people within the same city or region. Telephone technology gradually improved through the early 20th century. The introduction of the rotary dial in the 1920s allowed subscribers to place local calls without operator assistance, increasing system capacity and reducing operating costs. Automatic switching equipment replaced manual switchboards for most routine calls, though operators remained essential for long-distance connections and assistance. The familiar black desk telephone, with its heavy handset and bell ringer, became a standard fixture in offices and increasingly in homes through the middle decades of the century. The transistor's invention in 1947 at Bell Laboratories initiated a transformation in telecommunications electronics. Transistors replaced vacuum tubes in telephone equipment, reducing size, power consumption, and heat generation while increasing reliability. This seemingly modest improvement enabled progressive miniaturization and sophistication of telephone networks. Electronic switching systems began replacing electromechanical equipment, allowing faster call setup and enabling new services. Touch-tone dialing, introduced in the 1960s, used audio tones instead of rotary pulses, speeding call completion and laying groundwork for computer telephone integration. International telephone service expanded through the mid-20th century using undersea cables and radio links. The first transatlantic telephone cable, TAT-1, began operation in 1956, providing 36 simultaneous voice circuits between North America and Europe. Previous transatlantic calls had used radio, which suffered from atmospheric interference and limited capacity. The cable delivered much clearer connections and marked the beginning of reliable international telephone service. Additional cables followed, progressively increasing capacity and improving quality. The telephone transformed social interaction and business practices profoundly. Families separated by distance could maintain closer relationships through regular phone conversations than had been possible with letters alone. Business could be conducted at a distance, reducing the need for time-consuming travel or delays waiting for correspondence. Emergency services could be summoned instantly, saving countless lives. The telephone became so integral to modern life that its absence was considered a hardship, and ensuring universal telephone service became a policy goal in many countries. Yet even as the telephone reached near universal adoption in developed nations by the late 20th century, the technology remained fundamentally tethered. Users could only make or receive calls where wires connected them to the network. A truly mobile telephone would require dispensing with wires altogether, combining telephony with wireless radio transmission. This convergence would create the most personal and ubiquitous telecommunications technology yet devised, one that would fundamentally reshape human communication and society. The dream of wireless telephony existed almost as long as the telephone itself, but creating practical mobile phone systems required solving challenges far more complex than those faced by early radio pioneers. A mobile telephone network needed to cover wide geographic areas, handle many simultaneous users, efficiently use limited radio spectrum, and enable users to move freely while maintaining connections. These requirements pushed engineering to its limits through much of the 20th century. Early mobile radio telephone systems appeared in the 1940s, primarily serving emergency vehicles and taxis. These systems used powerful transmitters on tall towers to cover entire cities, with mobile units carrying heavy radio equipment. Only a few dozen users could be accommodated simultaneously because each conversation occupied a dedicated radio channel across the entire coverage area. The equipment filled car trunks, consumed significant power, and remained far too expensive for general consumer use. Despite these limitations, the systems demonstrated that mobile voice communication was technically possible. The conceptual breakthrough enabling modern cellular telephony came from engineers at Bell Laboratories in the late 1940s. They proposed dividing geographic areas into cells, each served by a low-power transmitter. Because transmission power was limited, the same radio frequencies could be reused in non-adjacent cells without interference, multiplying system capacity enormously. As users moved between cells, their calls would be automatically handed off to new transmitters. This cellular concept solved the spectrum scarcity problem that had constrained earlier mobile systems, though implementing it required technological capabilities that would take decades to develop. The first generation of cellular networks emerged in the 1970s and 80s, beginning with Japan's launch of commercial service in 1979 and followed by the Nordic mobile telephone system in 1981. These systems used analog radio transmission, similar to FM radio broadcasting, to carry voice conversations. The United States launched its Advanced Mobile Phone System, AMPS, in 1983. While revolutionary at the time, these first-generation systems suffered from limited capacity, poor security, and large, expensive handsets. The Motorola Dynatac 8000X, released in 1983, weighed 2 pounds and cost nearly $4,000, positioning it firmly as a luxury product for business users. Martin Cooper, an engineer at Motorola, made the first handheld cellular phone call in April 1973, standing on a New York City street and calling a rival at Bell Labs. Cooper later recalled the satisfaction of demonstrating Motorola's achievement directly to competitors, embodying the intense commercial rivalry driving mobile phone development. His prototype handset, while groundbreaking, exemplified first-generation limitations. It offered 30 minutes of talk time after 10 hours of charging and weighed more than modern laptops. The transition to second-generation digital cellular systems in the 1990s transformed mobile telephony from an expensive niche product into a mass-market phenomenon. Digital transmission offered numerous advantages over analog systems: more efficient use of spectrum allowing more simultaneous users, better voice quality, improved security through encryption, and the ability to transmit data alongside voice. Europe adopted the GSM standard, achieving unprecedented international compatibility, while the United States deployed multiple competing standards, including IS-95 CDMA and IS 136 TDMA. Digital cellular technology also enabled a new form of communication: text messaging. The short message service, SMS, originally conceived as a way for network operators to send notifications to subscribers, unexpectedly became enormously popular for person-to-person communication. The 160-character limitation, imposed by technical constraints of signaling channels, created a distinct communication style characterized by brevity and creative abbreviation. Text messaging proved particularly popular among younger users, and in situations where voice calls were impractical or socially inappropriate. Mobile phone adoption accelerated dramatically through the late 1990s and early 2000s. Handsets became smaller, lighter, and more affordable as manufacturing scaled up and component technology improved. Prepaid service plans removed credit barriers, making mobile phones accessible to populations previously excluded from telecommunications. In developing nations, mobile phones often provided the first telephone service many people had ever experienced, leapfrogging the fixed-line infrastructure that had characterized telecommunications in wealthy countries. This pattern of technology leapfrogging would repeat as mobile networks expanded globally. The third generation of mobile networks, launching around the year 2000, focused on data transmission. 3G systems delivered internet access to mobile devices at speeds previously available only through wired connections. This capability enabled mobile email, web browsing, and multimedia messaging, transforming phones from voice-centric devices into portable computers. The infrastructure requirements were substantial, requiring carriers to deploy entirely new radio equipment and substantially increase backhaul capacity, connecting cell sites to core networks. The investment ran into hundreds of billions of dollars globally, reflecting the industry's confidence in mobile data's future importance. Nokia, a Finnish company that had begun as a paper mill in the 19th century, dominated the mobile phone market through the early 2000s. Their phones combined reliability, battery life, and intuitive interfaces, while their infrastructure equipment served networks worldwide. Nokia's success demonstrated how a relatively small company from a nation of 5 million people could lead a global industry through engineering excellence and understanding user needs. However, Nokia's dominance would prove temporary as the smartphone revolution approached. The introduction of the iPhone by Apple in 2007 represented a watershed moment in mobile telecommunications. While smartphones had existed for years, combining phone capabilities with computing functions, the iPhone's intuitive touch interface, elegant design, and seamless integration of internet services created a new product category. The device eliminated physical keyboards in favor of a large touch screen, trusted sophisticated software to interpret user intentions, and positioned third-party applications as central to the experience through the App Store, launched in 2008. Google's Android operating system, released to device manufacturers as open-source software, created an alternative smartphone ecosystem that rapidly gained market share through diversity of devices at various price points. The competition between iOS and Android drove rapid innovation in hardware and software, creating a dynamic market that delivered continuous improvements in capability while reducing costs. Within a few years, smartphones powerful enough to run complex applications became affordable to billions of users worldwide. Fourth-generation LTE networks, deploying from 2010 onward, delivered mobile data speeds rivaling home broadband connections. LTE represented a fundamental architectural shift, treating voice as just another data stream rather than as a circuit-switched service requiring dedicated resources. This all-IP approach increased efficiency and positioned mobile networks to handle the explosive growth in data consumption driven by video streaming, social media, and cloud services. The smartphone in every pocket had become not just a communications device, but a portal to the entire digital world. Mobile telecommunications had evolved in less than 4 decades, from expensive car phones serving tiny elite markets to universal devices connecting billions of people across all continents. The mobile phone became humanity's most ubiquitous technology, present in regions lacking electricity or clean water, carried by people of all ages and economic circumstances. This remarkable diffusion reflected both the fundamental human need to communicate and the technology's adaptability to diverse needs and contexts. Yet even as mobile networks reached this maturity, the next generation of wireless technology was already under development, promising capabilities that would push telecommunications into new domains entirely. While wireless technologies captured public attention through the 20th century, a quieter revolution was unfolding in the physics of light transmission. The idea of using light to carry information was ancient, dating back to the fire beacons and optical telegraphs that represented humanity's earliest long-distance communication methods. However, modern optical communications would harness light in ways those ancient engineers could never have imagined, using principles discovered only in the 20th century and materials that barely existed in nature. The theoretical foundation emerged in the 1960s when several researchers independently proposed that extremely pure glass fibers could carry light signals over long distances. Charles Cow, working at Standard Telecommunication Laboratories in England, and George Hockham published calculations in 1966 demonstrating that if glass could be manufactured with sufficient purity, it could transmit light with minimal loss over practical distances. At the time, even the highest quality optical glass lost most transmitted light within a few meters. Cow's proposal required reducing impurities to levels thought nearly impossible to achieve. The challenge lay in the nature of light absorption by materials. Even tiny concentrations of impurities, measured in parts per billion, would absorb photons and convert their energy to heat, attenuating the signal. Manufacturing glass pure enough for Cow's vision required developing entirely new production techniques. Corning Glass Works in the United States took up this challenge, and in 1970, researchers Robert Maurer, Donald Keck, and Peter Schultz succeeded in creating optical fiber with losses low enough to make telecommunications practical. Their achievement opened the door to a transformation in communications infrastructure. Optical fibers work by containing light through total internal reflection. The fiber consists of an inner core of glass surrounded by cladding with a slightly lower refractive index. When light enters the core at an appropriate angle, it reflects off the core cladding boundary repeatedly as it travels along the fiber, remaining confined even as the fiber bends. This elegant principle allows hair-thin glass strands to guide light around corners and through thousands of miles of cable with remarkably little loss. The light remains pure and distinct, carrying information encoded in its intensity or other properties. Early optical communication systems used light-emitting diodes as sources and operated at relatively slow speeds over short distances. The development of semiconductor lasers provided much more powerful and precisely controlled light sources, essential for long-distance transmission. These lasers, initially large and expensive, rapidly shrank and improved through the 1970s and 80s. Concurrently, engineers developed sensitive photodetectors capable of converting extremely faint light signals back into electrical currents with minimal noise. The combination of efficient lasers, ultra-pure fiber, and sensitive detectors created complete optical communication systems. The first commercial fiber optic telecommunication systems appeared in the late 1970s, primarily for high-capacity links between telephone switching centres in urban areas. The advantages over copper cables became immediately apparent. A single optical fibre could carry far more simultaneous conversations than a copper wire bundle many times larger. Fibre was immune to electromagnetic interference that plagued copper systems. The glass material itself was less expensive than copper, though manufacturing processes remained costly. Initial installations proved the technology viable, encouraging rapid expansion. Undersea fibre optic cables revolutionised international telecommunications beginning in the late 1980s. The first transatlantic fibre cable, TAT-8, began operation in 1988 with capacity for 40,000 simultaneous telephone circuits, nearly matching the total capacity of all previous transatlantic cables combined. Unlike earlier copper cables that required expensive amplifiers every few kilometres, fibre optic cables could span much greater distances before requiring signal regeneration. This characteristic made transoceanic fibre cables economically viable despite the extraordinary challenges of deep water installation. The 1990s witnessed explosive growth in fibre optic infrastructure, driven by internet expansion and increasing demand for bandwidth. Telecommunications companies invested hundreds of billions of dollars laying fibre cables along highways, through cities, and across ocean floors. This infrastructure build-out, sometimes called the fibre optic boom, dramatically increased global communications capacity. The investment proved prescient as data traffic grew exponentially, though the boom also saw significant overbuilding in some markets, with more fibre installed than near-term demand required. Wavelength division multiplexing, commercialised in the late 1990s, multiplied fibre capacity spectacularly. This technology allowed multiple laser signals at different wavelengths to travel through the same fibre simultaneously, each carrying independent information streams. A single fibre could carry dozens, then hundreds of wavelengths, each operating at billions of bits per second. The multiplication of capacity without laying new cable proved economically transformative, allowing carriers to meet growing demand by upgrading equipment at cable endpoints rather than excavating streets to install additional fibres. Charles Cow shared the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2009 for his pioneering work on fibre optic communications, recognition that the technology had fundamentally transformed global telecommunications. By that time, fibre optic cables formed the backbone of the internet, carrying the vast majority of long-distance data traffic. The cables crisscrossed continents and oceans, creating a global optical nervous system transmitting information at nearly the speed of light. Modern fibre systems achieved transmission speeds and capacities that would have seemed fantastical to Cow's colleagues in the 1960s. The extension of fibre optic connections directly to homes and businesses, fibre to the premises, began in the early 21st century. This deployment brought gigabit per second internet speeds to consumers, enabling high-definition video streaming, cloud computing, and other bandwidth-intensive applications. Countries including South Korea and Japan led in fibre-to-the-home deployment, achieving high penetration rates that positioned their populations to take advantage of emerging internet services. The economics of last-mile fibre installation varied by density and geography, with urban areas typically receiving service before rural regions. Modern fibre optic technology approaches theoretical limits of information transmission. Specialised fibres and advanced modulation schemes enable individual fibres to carry hundreds of terabits of data per second, enough bandwidth to stream millions of high-definition videos simultaneously. The technology's capacity continues growing through innovation in lasers, detectors, and signal processing, while the physical fibre infrastructure installed decades ago remains relevant. This longevity contrasts sharply with wireless systems that require periodic infrastructure replacement as standards evolve. Fiber optic sensing emerged as an important application beyond communications. The fibers can detect vibrations, temperature changes, and strain along their length, enabling monitoring of pipelines, detecting earthquakes, securing perimeters, and numerous other applications. These sensing systems exploit the same principles that make fiber useful for communications, using light's properties to extract information about the physical environment. The dual use demonstrates how telecommunications technologies often find applications beyond their original purposes. As the second decade of the 21st century progressed, fiber optic infrastructure formed the essential foundation for virtually all telecommunications. Mobile phone towers connected to fiber backhaul, data centers linked through fiber networks, and submarine cables carried international traffic through fiber strands. The technology had evolved from a laboratory curiosity to the physical layer supporting global digital civilization. Yet even as fiber's dominance seemed complete, satellites orbiting far above Earth's surface were experiencing their own revolution, promising to extend connectivity to every corner of the planet. The use of satellites for telecommunications began as an extension of the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 demonstrated that artificial satellites could orbit Earth, immediately suggesting applications beyond scientific research and national prestige. If satellites could be placed in orbit, they could serve as relay stations for radio communications, potentially reaching areas inaccessible to terrestrial infrastructure and enabling truly global telecommunications coverage. Arthur C. Clarke, the British science fiction author and futurist, had described the basic concept in a technical paper published in 1945. Clarke calculated that a satellite placed in orbit, approximately 35,000 kilometers above Earth's equator, would circle the planet at exactly the same rate as Earth's rotation, appearing stationary relative to the ground. 3 such satellites, spaced evenly around the equator, could provide line-of-sight coverage to nearly the entire planet, except the polar regions. Clarke's geostationary orbit concept provided the theoretical foundation for modern satellite communications, though he modestly doubted that his idea would be implemented during his lifetime. The first communications satellite, Project SCORE, launched by the United States in December 1958, demonstrated the feasibility of orbital relay systems. SCORE carried a tape recorder that received radio messages from ground stations, stored them, and retransmitted when over receiving stations. The satellite broadcast President Eisenhower's Christmas message to the world, proving that space-based communications could work. However, SCORE operated in low Earth orbit, limiting its usefulness for continuous communications as it quickly passed out of range of any given ground station. Telstar, launched in July 1962, became the first satellite to relay television signals across the Atlantic Ocean. Built by Bell Laboratories and launched by NASA, Telstar orbited Earth in an elliptical path every 2 hours and 40 minutes. During the brief periods when the satellite was simultaneously visible from ground stations in the United States and Europe, it could relay live television and telephone signals between continents. The first public broadcast showed the Statue of Liberty and the Eiffel Tower, demonstrating instantaneous visual connection between distant locations. Despite its low orbit's limitations, Telstar captured public imagination and demonstrated satellite communications potential. The first successful geostationary communications satellite, SYNCOM-3, launched in August 1964 and was positioned over the Pacific Ocean. Unlike earlier satellites in lower, faster orbits, SYNCOM remained fixed relative to the ground, allowing continuous communications without tracking across the sky. The satellite famously transmitted live coverage of the 1964 Summer Olympics from Tokyo to the United States, the first major international event broadcast via satellite. This achievement validated Clarke's theoretical predictions and established the geostationary orbit as the preferred position for communications satellites. The International Telecommunications Satellite Organization, Intelsat, formed in 1964 to develop a global satellite communications network. This cooperative organization, initially dominated by the United States, but including dozens of member nations, launched a series of progressively more capable satellites. Early Bird, also known as Intelsat 1, launched in April 1965, provided the first regular commercial transatlantic satellite communications service, handling television broadcasts and telephone calls. The satellite could carry 240 telephone circuits or one television channel, modest capacity by modern standards but revolutionary at the time. Satellite technology advanced rapidly through the 1970s and 80s. Satellites grew larger and more powerful, carrying multiple transponders that could handle thousands of simultaneous telephone conversations or several television channels. Solar panels provided electrical power, antenna designs improved to focus signals on specific regions, and onboard electronics became more sophisticated. Launch vehicles increased in capacity, allowing heavier satellites with longer operational lifetimes. The geostationary orbit filled with satellites serving telecommunications, broadcasting, and other purposes. The development of smaller, more affordable ground terminals democratized satellite communications. Early satellite ground stations required massive dish antennas, complex electronics, and skilled operators. As satellites increased their transmission power and electronics miniaturized, receiving equipment shrank accordingly. By the 1980s, satellite television reception became possible with modest dish antennas affordable for home installation. This enabled direct broadcast satellite television services that bypassed terrestrial cable networks, bringing hundreds of channels to remote areas where cable infrastructure didn't exist. Maritime and aviation communications benefited enormously from satellite technology. Ships at sea and aircraft in flight could maintain contact with shore facilities through satellites when beyond range of terrestrial radio systems. The International Maritime Satellite Organization, Inmarsat, established in 1979, provided safety communications for vessels worldwide, allowing distress calls from anywhere in the ocean and enabling routine ship-to-shore communications. Similar systems served aviation, enhancing safety through continuous contact between aircraft and air traffic control, even over remote oceanic routes. Mobile satellite phones emerged in the 1990s, offering voice communications from anywhere on Earth through handheld or portable terminals. Several competing systems launched constellations of satellites in low or medium Earth orbits, providing global coverage, including polar regions that geostationary satellites couldn't reach. The Iridium system, despite initial commercial struggles, created a network of 66 satellites enabling truly global mobile phone service. While larger and more expensive than terrestrial mobile phones, satellite phones served users in remote locations, disaster response teams, and others requiring communications beyond cellular network coverage. The 21st century brought new ambitions for satellite telecommunications. Traditional geostationary satellites provided excellent coverage and required relatively few satellites, but their high altitude created signal delay noticeable in two-way conversations. Low Earth orbit satellite constellations, operating at altitudes of a few hundred to a few thousand kilometers, could deliver lower latency connections while providing global coverage. However, these systems required hundreds or thousands of satellites to maintain continuous coverage as individual satellites moved rapidly across the sky. SpaceX's Starlink constellation, beginning deployment in 2019, represented a new generation of low Earth orbit communications systems. The company planned to launch tens of thousands of satellites to provide high-speed internet access globally, including to underserved rural and remote areas. Advances in satellite manufacturing, launch technology, and ground terminal design made the economics feasible where earlier similar concepts had failed. Each Starlink satellite weighed only a few hundred kilograms, but could serve hundreds of users simultaneously with broadband speeds comparable to terrestrial fiber connections. Other companies and national space agencies announced similar mega-constellation plans, including Amazon's Project Kuiper and OneWeb's satellite internet system. These massive deployments raise concerns about orbital congestion, collision risks, and light pollution affecting astronomical observations. The projects also highlighted regulatory challenges of managing the increasingly crowded space environment and coordinating radio spectrum use among thousands of satellites. Nevertheless, the momentum toward deploying large-scale satellite internet constellations appeared unstoppable as companies invested billions in realizing global connectivity visions. Satellite communications complemented rather than replaced terrestrial networks. Fiber optic cables carried the vast majority of internet traffic between cities and continents, offering far higher capacity and lower costs per bit than satellites. Terrestrial mobile networks served urban populations efficiently through dense tower deployments. Satellites excelled in reaching remote areas, mobile platforms, and situations requiring rapid deployment without existing infrastructure. The technologies formed an integrated global telecommunications ecosystem, each serving roles suited to its strengths. As satellites became more numerous and capable, they represented both the newest frontier and the closing of a circle in telecommunications history. Like the ancient fire beacons that communicated across mountaintops, satellites used light and radio waves to bridge vast distances. Unlike those ancient systems, modern satellites could relay complex data at extraordinary speeds, connecting anyone anywhere to the global information network. The dream of universal connectivity, pursued through centuries of technological evolution, approached realization through the convergence of terrestrial and satellite systems working in concert. The convergence of mobile networks, computing power, and internet protocols in the early 21st century set the stage for the fifth generation of wireless telecommunications. While previous generations focused on improving voice quality, data speeds, or capacity, 5G represented something more fundamental, a reimagining of wireless networks as universal connectivity platforms capable of supporting not just human communication, but the emerging Internet of Things, autonomous vehicles, remote surgery, and applications not yet conceived. The standardization process for 5G began in the early 2010s, with industry groups worldwide collaborating to define technical specifications. Unlike earlier generations where different regions adopted incompatible standards, 5G achieved remarkable global consensus through the third generation partnership project, 3GPP. This cooperation reflected telecommunications maturation into a truly global industry where interoperability delivered value to all participants, enabling economies of scale in device manufacturing and facilitating seamless international roaming. 5G technology introduced several key innovations beyond simply increasing speeds. The networks use higher radio frequencies, including millimeter wave bands above 24 GHz, which offer enormous bandwidth but travel shorter distances and penetrate obstacles poorly. To overcome these limitations, 5G employs massive multiple input, multiple output systems, massive MIMO, using dozens or hundreds of antenna elements to focus signals precisely toward users. These antenna arrays can simultaneously serve multiple users on the same frequency through spatial multiplexing, dramatically increasing capacity in crowded areas. Network slicing represents another fundamental innovation, allowing a single physical network to function as multiple virtual networks with different performance characteristics. A telecommunications provider can create one network slice optimized for smartphone traffic, another for autonomous vehicle communications requiring ultra-low latency, and another for sensors requiring minimal power consumption but tolerating delays. This flexibility enables 5G networks to efficiently serve diverse applications with vastly different requirements, something previous generations could not achieve. The latency reduction achieved by 5G opens possibilities previously impractical with wireless communications. Latency drops from tens of milliseconds, typical in 4G networks, to potentially less than 1 millisecond in 5G. This near instantaneous response enables applications like remote surgery, where surgeons manipulate robotic instruments thousands of miles away, or autonomous vehicles that coordinate movements to avoid collisions. The reduction proves critical for applications requiring real-time interaction with minimal delay. Commercial 5G deployments began in 2019, with South Korea, the United States, and China among the first countries to launch services. Initial rollouts focused on urban areas using millimeter wave frequencies for maximum speeds, delivering gigabit per second connections to smartphones and fixed wireless home internet services. These early deployments revealed both 5G's potential and its challenges, as high-frequency signals required dense networks of small cells mounted on streetlights, utility poles, and buildings. The infrastructure requirements proved substantial. Telecommunications companies invested hundreds of billions of dollars globally in spectrum licenses, equipment upgrades, and new antenna installations. Each cell site required fiber optic connections capable of handling enormous data throughput. In many markets, fiber backhaul became the limiting factor in rollout speed, as laying fiber to thousands of small cell sites required extensive construction and negotiation for site access. The investment reflected industry confidence that 5G would enable entirely new services justifying the expenditure. 5G support for massive numbers of simultaneous connections enables the Internet of Things to reach its full potential. Previous wireless standards could support tens of thousands of devices per square kilometre. 5G specifications allow for up to 1 million devices in the same area. This density supports smart city applications, where sensors monitor everything from traffic flow to air quality, industrial facilities with thousands of wireless sensors, and agricultural systems where soil moisture monitors and weather stations create data-rich farming environments. Edge computing emerged as a crucial complement to 5G networks. Rather than transmitting all data to distant data centers for processing, edge computing places computational resources at network edges, near users. This architecture reduces latency by processing time-sensitive data locally, while still leveraging cloud resources for less urgent tasks. 5G's low latency and high bandwidth make edge computing practical for applications from augmented reality to industrial automation, creating distributed computing environments that blur boundaries between network and computation. The public health crisis of 2020 accelerated appreciation for reliable telecommunications infrastructure. As populations worldwide shifted to remote work, online education, and virtual social interaction, networks carried unprecedented traffic loads. The crisis highlighted digital divides where some communities enjoyed abundant connectivity, while others struggled with inadequate service. 5G deployments began expanding to rural and underserved areas, partly in response to demonstrated need for universal connectivity. Private 5G networks emerged as an important use case, particularly for industrial applications. Rather than relying on public telecommunications networks, enterprises could deploy their own 5G infrastructure tailored to specific needs. Factories used private networks to connect robots and automated systems. Ports deployed them to coordinate autonomous cargo handling equipment, and mines operated them to control remotely operated vehicles underground. These private networks offered control, security, and customization public networks couldn't match. Looking across the full sweep of telecommunications history reveals a consistent pattern. Each advancement increased communication speed, reach, and capacity while reducing costs and expanding access. From smoke signals visible for miles to satellites connecting entire continents, from telegraph keys clicking messages to smartphones streaming high-definition video, the trajectory has always been toward faster, farther, and more inclusive communication. The technical sophistication of modern systems would seem like magic to ancient signal operators on the Great Wall or Victorian telegraph clerks, yet the fundamental human need being served remains unchanged. Telecommunications technology has fundamentally restructured human society. Distance no longer isolates communities or limits commerce. Information flows instantly across the planet, enabling coordination and cooperation at global scales. Knowledge once confined to libraries and experts becomes accessible to anyone with network connectivity. Yet through all this change, telecommunications serves the same essential purpose it has always served, allowing us to extend our voices and thoughts beyond the immediate present, to connect with others across distance and time. As we settle into sleep, the networks continue operating, packets of data traversing fiber strands and radio waves, satellites circling overhead, undersea cables carrying conversations and videos and messages between continents. The global telecommunications infrastructure never rests, a technological nervous system for our civilization, connecting billions of people in an ongoing conversation that spans the planet. It represents one of humanity's greatest collective achievements, built incrementally over centuries through the contributions of countless engineers, inventors, workers, and visionaries. From ancient fire beacons to 5G networks, from smoke signals to satellites, the story of telecommunications is the story of our enduring drive to communicate, to share, to connect across whatever distances separate us.